So I have planned to cover off quite a lot today, but if we don't get through it, I'm happy to share the slides for later. This is my acknowledgement of traditional owners in QUT, which is where I do all of my research. So I just acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nations owners, and also like to acknowledge the First Nations owners of the land where we are today, and acknowledge that they play a really important part in our communities. So yes, this is the content. So I'm going to try and cover a young driver problem, but thanks to Louise. Louise is gone. Louise has covered off some of that. I'm from Queensland. Anywhere in the world, the young driver problem is the same. Those graphs look the same. I'll touch on graduated licensing systems and what they've done for the decrease in crashes so far. My driver training research findings, I'll quickly cover off all of those over the last, I think it's been 7 years now. And then my potential solution to the young novice driver problem. So I'm really keen to hear your thoughts and your feedback around what I present today. Don't be too harsh. I am waiting on funding from government to actually show that this can be something really effective. So once I have that money, I'll be looking for driver trainers to help me roll this out. So I work closely with driver trainers in Queensland. I haven't had, I think, anything to do with New South Wales driver trainers, so quite privileged to be here today. And the last one, I've just got 3 myths that I would like to share with you so that you can get the word out there that these are myths. But if we don't have time, you can read those yourselves. So yes, we know that young drivers are persistently overrepresented in crashes. This is not a new problem. This has been going on for a really long time. As I said, in Queensland, it's no different to New South Wales. So in 2020, 29% of road crash fatalities for 16 to 24-year-olds. So it was 29%, yet they only 13% of licence holders. The hospitalised casualties, so the serious injuries that result from the crashes, is actually trending up. So in 2019 it was 31% for young drivers, and then in 2020 35%. If you look back over a 10-year period, you can see that going up. This is just a short time frame of 5 years, so it doesn't really reflect that trend, but fatalities have levelled off, so we have seen improvements. That's due to graduated licensing, improvement in roads, and improvement in vehicles as well. So just quickly touch on what contributes to this young driver problem. So we know that it is their age, and more so their inexperience, their driving inexperience. In regards to age, so you can see on this graph here, if you're become an independent driver at the age of 17, you're more at risk of a crash compared to a 60-year-old that gets their licence and drives independently for the first time. So what's happening with young drivers, they have a reward centre in their brain that starts to kick off in adolescence. And this is what encourages them to take risks, to seek out exciting things that can satisfy that need in their brain. Unfortunately, at the same time, their development of their self-regulation, which includes their self-control and their capacity to make really good decisions, it's developing slower. So that's why as they get into adulthood, as we get towards 25 years, self-regulation starts to kick in and they're better at making those decisions.
So is there a difference male-female?
Yes. We know, like in crashes, that males are overrepresented more than females, and yes, they tend to have a slower development. So the 25 years is an average, so females may get there sooner and males may take longer as well. So we make a joke sometimes it's up to 40 years, but I don't know how that sits in this room. sorry. So with the driving inexperience, what we've learnt is that it's correlated or it's associated with a lack of skills that we call higher order skills. So these higher order skills include things like hazard perception, which I know you're all familiar with. We have the hazard perception test, and that's why it's been introduced. Also includes things like situation awareness, so knowing what's happening around them, having insight, like have they got good insight into their level of, I guess, driving skills, and then do they behave in a way on our roads that matches that level that they're at. There's a lack of research in this area, so most people that have looked at the success of higher order skills, they're looking at it post-licence, so when equivalent of when they're on their red Ps, and most of the work's being done over in the US. So there's a lack of research, hence I decided to go into this field in depth. And from my research, I found that there is limited practice of instructors delivering what we call higher order instruction, which is the capacity to develop this whole range of higher order skills to young drivers before they're on their red Ps. And I also was able to identify that there's lots of opportunities for improvement. And yes, we have graduated licensing, so we have this extended number of hours. When graduated licensing was introduced, nobody kind of stood up and said, this is what we have to do with this extended number of hours. Sorry, I know you have 120 hours in New South Wales. Yeah. And that's the downfall. So we have noticed with graduated licensing, the success that it has had has kind of petered off. It's still absolutely worthwhile having it. We have seen a reduction in crashes from having graduated licensing, but it's now time for the next step. So it's like, what do we do? And this is where we've found the gap. It's like, what do we do with the 100 hours? So you saw this before. Learners are the safest. They're sharing, or the supervised driver is sharing that responsibility of what's happening on the road. So we expect them to be safer at this time. Then all of a sudden, overnight, they get their license, they go on the road by themselves. If the sharing hasn't been handed over correctly, their risk of crashing is higher. And then when we get to the green line, which is your P2, it's showing that they're developing their driving experience, but we want to fast track that before they get to that red P. Yeah.
Do you have a test or anything between P1 and P2 in Queensland?
No, because we shifted our hazard perception test to the end of learner. So before you do your practical on road. Yeah. So, yeah. No. Good. Okay. Good. I was very happy to hear that they shifted it. I didn't understand why they put it between P1 and P2, because they need to have those skills before they're driving independently. So we need to test them at that time. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Should there be anything between?
Sorry?
Should there be anything between P1 and P2?
Yes, there is, for another day. I think there should be things all the way along. So as I mentioned, graduated licensing, it addresses those age and driving inexperience vulnerabilities of young people. We have the extended learning phase so that the young person can gain that driving experience. How well are we doing that at the moment? I'm not really sure, because young drivers are still overrepresented in crashes. And then we have the restrictions put in place on these known risks for young drivers, so the nighttime driving, passengers in the vehicle, and these are gradually lifted. So that's basics of graduate licensing. So there's been a study on the success of graduated licensing in Queensland, and they did find a good decrease in crashes, and the largest decreases were in that first month of having their red P. And they were able to show that what contributed to that decrease in crashes was the longer learner phase, the higher supervised driving hours, the provisional night passenger restriction, And interesting one, with phone use restriction, it only reduced crashes during the learner phase. So have a think about that one, what's happening with our peer drivers. So yes, graduated licensing success has stagnated and young drivers are still overrepresented in crashes. So basically this says that graduated licensing in isolation can't fix the young novice driver problem. That's where I come in. And the latest recommendation out of the US has been that to take the next step with graduated licensing, we need to integrate our education and training with the system. So we need to be targeting those same age and inexperience vulnerabilities that young people face. And I see this as a core task of driving instructors. I work a lot with Queensland driving instructors. I think you guys are amazing what you do. So I think you have the capacity to take GLS to the next step. And just to highlight that education and training, this is mostly from the US, but hasn't been updated since graduated licensing was introduced, which has been quite some time now. So why I looked into on-road driver training, aside from the tragic crash fatalities of young people, there's limited research across the globe that actually looks at what's happening during that training, during the on-road training. So nobody knows what's happening in that time. How can we improve it if we don't know what happened? So I went back to the beginning to find out, what are we doing? And also research from quite some time ago suggested that driver education and training is not effective in reducing young driver crashes. So I also looked into that, and crashes are not necessarily the best outcome to be looking at. There's no direct link between training and education and crashes for a couple of reasons. There's a small number of crashes that occur in small populations, so it's very difficult to find that effect from driver education training. Plus, there's lots of things that influence crash rates. So of course, we can't just attribute it to one thing. The limited research that has been done, much of this is in Europe, on-road training, has shown that when they compare professional instruction to layperson or parent instruction or supervision, the professional instructors are able to improve the safety attitudes of young people. We know attitudes are associated with behavioural intentions, so that's a positive sign. And also self-calibration, so allowing the young driver to have insight into what their skill level is and then to behave appropriately to that skill level. And yes, recent research does focus on the hours of practice and the length of time to develop safe enough drivers, and we haven't actually come to an agreement about what is the optimal threshold. One research study did show that more hours equaled less crashes, but we still have 120 hours here, 100 hours in Queensland. Tasmania has 80 hours. I know Perth in 2016, where is he, was going to 50 hours. I don't know where they're at now. So it's different everywhere.
It's a more common thing based in Western Australia now.
Oh, it is?
Yep.
Oh, okay, exciting. Thank you. So this is what I've done in a snapshot and what I've found. So one of the things was I recorded 110 learner lessons delivered by 15 different driving instructors, and I sat and watched and coded and just spent a long time going through all of this. When it came to looking at the higher order instruction, over the 15 instructors, about 15% of their lessons, they're delivering high order instruction without even knowing what it is or being trained in it specifically. So that's not bad. One amazing instructor that we have up in Queensland was delivering 45% of high order instruction, which is really quite amazing. So of course I am his best friend and we work very closely together now. He calls me all the time. So then the second part of this research, I did interviews with the same 15 driving instructors. So I wanted to understand their experiences and just the perspective of training in general to see what they wanted to talk to me about, like what's happening. And just to give context to that situation, you know, I don't know why I'm telling you, but accreditation training to become a driving instructor is 12 modules. Less than half of that I can see. I haven't done the course myself, but I see less than half of that being directly related to the training of young learner drivers. And I also know that this is all about to change as well. And just at the other end of the spectrum, in Norway, you have to do 2 years at a university to become a driving instructor. It's the extreme. I don't believe Australia would ever get to that, but that's what's happening over there.
The crash rate's lower in Norway?
Yes. Norway has an excellent.
Maybe it's a good idea.
I keep bringing it up. And from 3 different studies in Queensland, we found that 90% of learner drivers do engage with a professional instructor, and it's for anywhere between 4 and 10 hours.
Any such research being done in New South Wales?
I found it very difficult to even find this number, so I don't know. But also I will recognise as well that in that 90%, these are young people doing surveys, so we tend to miss out on people that are remote, low socioeconomic, so they're the ones that we know are not included in this 90%. And I don't ever want to forget about them in anything we do. So these are just some of the quotes from the instructors, from the interviews. I'm going to go through this really quickly because I want to get to my proposal of higher order instruction and for the first time share to anyone what it actually is and what it looks like. So graduated licensing. So the instructors were telling me that quite often they'll encounter young drivers who claim to have done 100 hours, but their driving doesn't match that 100 hours. Others said 100 hours isn't enough, it's equal to 2.5 weeks of work experience. And also comments about the test, that it's not necessarily assessing safety. They talked about their accreditation training. They know that it's lacking and that there's things that need to be done there. They talked about parents. They wanted to see, and this was not the majority at all, but there were a lot of parents that are disengaged from the learners learning. They wanted to be able to get parents more engaged in this. And then just about learners' attitudes and behaviours. Up in Queensland, they can identify young drivers who they believe are risky. And they know that once they pass a test and they are able to get themselves through a test without coming across as a risky driver, 2 weeks later, they're in a crash. So I found that the instructors that I talked to, they're able to identify this, but they don't know what to do with the information. So there's no kind of, who do they tell, who can they report it to, how can we delay this from happening? And then I also spoke to novice drivers. So novice drivers also had something to say about the 100 hours. Some of them found it difficult that they didn't have access to a supervisor or they didn't have access to a vehicle. Cost of petrol's going up, so of course the cost factor. Working with a parent is very stressful. And they found that the test made them very nervous, anxious, nothing you wouldn't know here. This one not surprised me, but for young people, so these young people were aged 16 to 19 years old, and there was a lot of information that came out about how fearful they are, some of them. Some of them had even given up getting their licence because of what they see on the road and also what they hear from their peers at school, what they intend to do when they have their licence and they're driving on the road. So I feel like this is a really, it's an area that we need to tap into. And this is a bit of a mix going on here. One person had done an advanced driver course and was able to see that it had given them more confidence but not as much skill, and therefore they were taking risks, which research tells us if the advanced driver training is not delivered in the correct way, where you're able to get the learner driver to have that insight into where their skill level is actually at, it will increase their confidence and they're more likely to take risks or put themselves in risky situations. Let's move on. Okay, this is what I wanted to really share with you today. So the reason why I think higher order instruction could be part of a solution, I don't think, as I said, GLS can't fix everything on its own. We talk about systems thinking and systems theory and all of this, and it's about things need to work together. And that's why I think training and education, working together with graduated licensing, high order instruction, I see is what you can do with the 100 hours or with the 120 hours. And I don't believe that if you only see a learner driver once, they come to you just before their test, there's no reason why you still can't try and get some of this across to them. So higher order instruction. So we talk about, it's either higher order, and the other end of that is we talk about functional instruction. So functional instruction is that very directive instruction. So it's about turn left up there, brake now, the speed limit's 60, slow down. So it's not taking the instruction any further than just giving them this step-by-step, do this, do that. And we know that that type of instruction doesn't enable the learner to actually learn anything that they can then apply down the track. High order instruction, on the other hand, does teach them skills that they can transfer to different contexts and new contexts. So when they're on their Ps, if you've done this with them, we hope that they can transfer the skills that they've learned into that situation, including their ability to learn from their environment. So that's part of the higher order instruction, is that they have that capacity to be continually learning. So higher order instruction is quite simple, and it's just about explaining the how and why. So if you think about a learner driver you're in the car with them, and they're passing a cyclist. So higher order instruction, you need to talk to them about how are you going to approach this. So how far back did they notice the cyclist? Who's on the other side of the road coming the other way? Can they cross a solid white line? How do they judge what a metre and a half is? So there's all these different skills that you need to be able to teach them, and that's the how. And then you go on to the why. So why is it important that we give them this distance? It's like, don't just give them the rule. If we want to tap into what we call their mental models, which are those sustainable learning parts of the brain that they can pull out later when they're driving on their own, we need to do the how and why. So maybe with the cyclist needs that much space. If they come across a pothole, if they come across something, a cyclist needs to move, you've given them that space. Plus the research shows cyclists actually feel safer when they have that distance between the vehicle and themselves. So there's lots of different places where you can deliver higher order instruction. So I talk about like cues in the environment. Higher order instruction is very context specific. So you need to deliver it in relation to what's happening on the road. So it's not about driving along and then randomly talking about the risks of mobile phone use. It doesn't work that way. You need to be able to relate it to something that's happening now. So post-critical driving incidents is a really good time to deliver high order instruction. So if you've had to brake or accelerate for the learner driver, after that, have that conversation. High-risk environments, school environments, where there's work happening, roadworks happening. Providing a context or a general principle. So I'm sure you have in your back pocket different things about the risks of using mobile phones, the risks of 1 kilometre over the speed limit, these types of things. This is higher order instruction. anything that encourages situation awareness. So again, not just telling them. In this case, it could be asking them the question. It's like, what can you see that's happening up ahead? Like, and get them to talk about their own learning. That's how they guide their own learning, which is really important. Anything that's fostering planning. So this can be before you start the lesson for the day, talk about the trip that you're going to have. What route are you going on? What does the learner driver know about that route? Do they know that it gets congested? Are there traffic lights? Is there a difficult right turn? Anything like that. Planning's also about, I guess, looking ahead while you're driving. So it's about seeing those brake lights up ahead so they don't have to use their brake, they can just take their foot off the accelerator. Reinforcement of previous learning. So we're not saying that high order instruction is the be-all and end-all. Functional instruction is necessary. What we don't know at the moment is what's the right balance. So reinforcement will be anything when you start with the learner that you say, remember. So remember that we talked about X, Y, and Z. So it's like you're not having to repeat the high order instruction every time, but reminds them when they're in a new situation or a new context, remember we talked about this, you can also apply it here. And any driving tips, general driving advice, some of the lessons I watched, they had really cool acronyms and things to help learners remember different situations. So I was able to break the amazing job of what you all do down to 8 different categories of what you talk about during the lesson. I'm only giving you the top overview, so within each of these, for example, within car knowledge, I may have had 15 to 20 additional. This is a 9-page document, very detailed, from observing the lessons that you deliver. So just as an example, with car knowledge, functional instruction was defined as the location and function of car controls. I don't know if this is going to work. Yes. So these are all quotes from lessons, so you might need to be imaginative and picture the context. So this one, functional instruction, just push your clutch in and go through your gears for me. So just about show me that you can use the gears in this vehicle. Higher order instruction talks about the awareness of the safety function of car controls. So this one's about parking lights, so remember that no one can see you with just your parking lights. Obviously they were asking them to put their headlights on. So the next one was vehicle control and manoeuvring. So the functional instruction, how to control and manoeuvre the car in a given environment. So this example, push the clutch in, put the car into first gear, slowly remove your foot from the clutch as you press on the accelerator. That's functional. And then the higher order. So this is about understanding of interactions between the car functions, the driver, and the external environment, and what they need to do to be able to maintain control and move in the vehicle. So this one, it's best if you can practice braking gently, because if this road surface was wet and you brake that hard, you'd skid. So it's talking about what they need to do, what the environment is, and talking about the brake, so the car function. Mastery of traffic situation. So this is about your road rules knowledge, and we know that the higher order instruction is talking more about that rule. So functional, you need to give way to anyone on a roundabout. Higher order, just be patient with turning. With experience, you'll start to understand when it's good to turn, but for now, make sure you're comfortable before turning. So I am thinking that this was a right-hand turn. Surveillance, so this is just the action of observing if it's functional. So check your shoulder. And then the higher order is about observing, perceiving, and comprehending relevant information that influence driving decisions. So this one, have you seen how close that car is behind you? He's a bit too close, so you'll have to indicate earlier so that they can plan ahead. There were 3 elements that we found there was no I guess, opportunity for functional instruction, and these 3 were just about. You're laughing at my picture.
Last week, in one of the lessons, Giroux came out in front of the car with us.
Yeah, I live on a property every day. You just don't know which way they're going to turn. So this one is only about higher order instruction. If there's a risk in the situation that you're in, it has to be delivered as higher order instruction. And it's about understanding the driving adjustments that you need to make because of what's happened in the environment. So this one said, there are a lot of shadows in this area, so be aware that your eyes need to adjust. Just take care when you're in these areas. And ever since I heard the instructor say that, I now have problems with shadows. It's like, it stands out to me. Driving plan. So just on planning and talking about driving routes, and earlier I said about that when a learner gets to the end of the learner phase and then they're going on to the P1, it's about transferring the skills. So the parent and the instructor needs to finish transferring all the skills that that learner needs to drive on their own. A study done in Europe found that navigation is probably one of the worst ones that we don't do. We don't hand it over to the learner early enough so that they have those skills to navigate on their own. So this one, functional, is about just giving and receiving turn-by-turn instructions. So up at the next intersection, turn right. Higher order is about, do you know how to get from X to Y? You've got so many other things to think about when you're driving, so it's good to know in advance. So another one is about personal risk. So this one, only higher order, and it's understanding personal factors that contribute to risky driving. So this is the learner saying, I didn't sleep well last night, so the instructor makes the decision, let's stick to the roads you know today then, it's good to know how you're feeling. So you're giving feedback to the learner that it's good for them to recognise how that they're feeling, and you're also giving them the idea of what they would need to do in this situation. And it's like, don't go to anywhere unfamiliar. And then distraction. So when I did my study, this is the one that in the lessons I observed, we don't talk about distraction enough, and yet it's one of the biggest contributors to young people's car crashes. So yes, anything that contributes to attention diversion. The big one we know is a mobile phone. Quite often in the lessons I could hear mobile phones ringing, and I was like, this is a perfect opportunity, whether the phone should be ringing or not while they're having the lesson, but it's a perfect opportunity to talk about the risks of mobile phone. Oh, still enough time? Yes, okay. Racing through, but I got to my 3 myths. Okay, so myth 1. Young drivers take risks because their brains are not fully developed. So we hear this from researchers, we hear this from lots of people. It's not because they're not fully developed. It's just that their self-regulation is slower to develop. Their reward centre has taken off first. So it's just that balance that needs to come together, and then they can make smart decisions when that's happened.
What age does that happen?
That's the one I said before. We can argue. So they say on average around 25 years.
About 60 for blokes.
Yeah. I'm not saying it again. And also those extreme risk-taking young people are actually rare, but the problem is when they do take those serious risks on the road, the chances of their crash being a fatal crash is more likely. And unfortunately, it's more males who engage in the high risk-taking. And I'll share something else with you in a minute. And actually, risk-taking is the result of healthy developmental phase. So an adolescent should go through this. We just need to find a safe way for them to do it. 100 hours of supervised driving over 12 months is excessive. It is not excessive. We just need to develop the strategies with the young learners to keep them out of other road users' crashes. So it's like, not even if it's their fault. You often hear of a young driver who's in a crash because of someone else. But did the learner driver have the skills to avoid that situation. This was a quote from the person that developed these myths or counteracted these myths. Reducing these hours would deny young people access to an evidence-based intervention with life-saving consequences. So you're having the extra learning time, reduces jail time, large fines, vehicle damage, loss of freedom due to injury and loss of life. And then the last one, I mentioned before, it's widely out there in research that driver education and training is not effective in reducing crash rates. So measuring it as crash rates is not necessarily the best way, and I will always argue that it's not necessarily the way. Yes. And because of that, that's why I believe that people have moved away from looking at the driver training and education that we deliver to learner drivers. And I said about crash rates in small populations are rare. So I just wanted to mention too another study that I've done. So when I talked about higher order instruction, I gave you the content part of that instruction, but there's also strategies and techniques in the way it's delivered. And the preliminary results that I got from research, if higher order instruction is delivered in this particular way using these strategies, we don't just reduce the risky behaviours of what we call the, I guess, inattentive or unintentional risks that young people get into. These are things like forgetting the speed limit sign, so therefore they're speeding. It's not an intentional speeding. But these strategies were actually able to reduce also those intentional ones. So they're your high risk takers. We can also see success in working with those people in this way. And that's it.